So we define potential GDP as the maximum GDP that a country can produce for a certain sustained, reasonably lengthy period of time. So it's potential output. It's not the absolute maximum GDP, because absolute maximum, I mean, for a couple of days a country can just go crazy and maybe everybody starts working for 20 out of 24 hours a day and without weekends and so on and so forth. That would give you the absolute maximum. The potential GDP is always less than this absolute maximum. This potential GDP is the maximum sustainable amount of output that the country can continuously produce for some given period of time. Now we can mark out, or you can say we can assume that the imaginary country that we are going to look at, let's assume that its potential GDP, YP, happens to be here at this point on this x-axis, where we usually measure the total output, the total GDP. Now, given this potential of the economy, this potential GDP, in the short run, the economy can end up in three different possible equilibrium positions. So remember, as we have already learned, the short-run equilibrium, it will always be determined by the point where the aggregate demand curve intersects the short-run aggregate supply curve. But we can draw the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply in a way that they intersect at this point, where this would show you a situation where the GDP that the economy produces in the short run, YE1 star, is exactly equal to that country's potential GDP. Now, the other possibility is that if you assume, starting from this equilibrium E1, if you assume aggregate demand falling and decreasing, moving to the left to AD2, then we will move to this new equilibrium E2, at which point you have the second situation where the country ends up producing an amount of GDP which is less than its potential. And similarly, again starting off with this equilibrium E1, let's assume the aggregate demand shifts to AD3, which would give us the short-run equilibrium at this point E3, where you will end up as a country producing GDP in the short run which is more than your country's potential GDP. So three different possible short-run situations. You can be at your potential, you can be below, or you can be above your potential. Now, before I move on and develop these ideas, it is very useful for you to remember that we can depict all of these three situations on the graph or the model of the production possibilities curve that we developed in the AS Micro course. Now, production possibility curves, remember, tells us the maximum possible combinations of two goods that a country can possibly produce. It's a completely theoretical model. And we learned that any point on this PPC is reflecting a certain maximum possible combination of the two goods that this country can produce. So this is where we say that, look, this equilibrium E1 where the country is producing its potential GDP, it's like being on one of these points on the country's PPC. So this is obviously going to be a desirable position to be in the short run. There's going to be full employment of resources, and you are doing as best as you possibly can given the quantity and quality of your country's resources. Whereas this equilibrium E2, it is an undesirable position to be in. Your GDP that the country is actually producing is less than its potential. So this is like being on a point inside a PPC, which we have already learned just tells us that, look, you are underutilizing your resources. There is unemployment if you are just producing this combination of these two goods, and you are ending up inside your PPC, meaning you are producing less than your potential. So this is where we say that this equilibrium E2 is equivalent to being at a point inside your PPC. Now this difference, when you are below your potential GDP, then this difference between what you actually produce and the potential output, this difference is known as the deflationary gap. Now this last situation, this equilibrium E3, when your actual GDP is more than the potential, then this difference between the two is known as the inflationary gap. So as I said, good to know how you can depict these three short-run equilibria also on the PPC. But let me now move on to our main task, which is using the situation that we have developed to try and understand how the economy moves into the long run and the eventual equilibrium that the macroeconomy settles in the long run. Now, to understand the long run analysis of the macroeconomy, we have to differentiate between the monetarists' view and the Keynesians' view. So I will start off first of all by explaining to you the monetarists' view, and through that we will take the discussion towards the end, or perhaps in the next video, to also cover the Keynesian view and the Keynesian version of the long run of this ADAS model. Now, monetarists, first of all, remember I told you those economists who believe that the free market economic systems, they are efficient, and they strongly believe in the power of the economies to self-correct and always reach nice equilibriums. And as far as the long run in this model of AD and AS is concerned, these monetarists believe that these deflationary and inflationary gaps, when your economy goes below its potential GDP or above its potential GDP, monetarists believe that these fluctuations around potential output, they are natural. They will always happen. You can't avoid them. In fact, monetarists give these fluctuations around the potential output in the short run a specific name. They call them business cycles. So they say they are inevitable. They are a natural part of any economy. But then these monetarists say that you don't need to worry about these deflationary or inflationary gaps. Because in the long run, these monetarists say that deflationary and inflationary gaps, they will just disappear. They will self-correct, and the economy will always move back to its potential output. It is going to be efficient in the long run. It is going to self-correct these deflationary and inflationary gaps. Now, let me quickly explain how they sort of justify, or how these monetarists theoretically explain why this self-correction will take place. Now, to understand that, let's assume we start off with this initial equilibrium of E1 given this aggregate demand AD1 and the SRAS1. Now, starting off in this nice equilibrium where your economy in the short run is at its potential GDP, let's assume the aggregate demand falls to AD2, and therefore the equilibrium moves to this E2. Now, as compared to E1 at this new equilibrium, notice here that the price levels have fallen and the GDP has also fallen below its potential. Now, the short run in which this deflationary gap monetarists say will exist, this short run has been defined as the period of time during which the wages are sticky, meaning that as the economy goes into this deflationary gap and as the general price levels start to fall, we are assuming that as long as we are in the short run, the wages, they are stuck and they are not decreasing in line with the falling price levels. But the monetarists say that, look, if you think about this situation, you are saying that all the price levels in the economy have gone down, wages are stuck, fine, but you also have to realize that the economy has gone below its potential, meaning that there is unemployment, there are going to be few jobs that are available, and gradually, these monetarists say that in the long run, the wages, they will start falling in line with these price levels. The wages in the long run, they will become unstuck. And these many unemployed people, they will eventually start accepting lower wages just to find some sort of a job. And when this long run is reached and when wages start to eventually fall, then remember, a fall in wages means a decrease in the cost of production, which we have already learned would cause that period's short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. And this aggregate supply will shift to the right until and unless it gets to this point. Let's call it AS3. So this new aggregate demand and this newly shifted aggregate supply, they will eventually intersect at this point where the country will be back to its potential output. So that is first of all how monetarists explain. In the long run, deflationary gaps, they will disappear. Wages will fall, short-run aggregate supply will start shifting to the right, and that will take the economy back to its potential output. They have a similar explanation of why do these inflationary gaps will also self-correct. So again, let's start from this initial assumed equilibrium of E1, and then let's assume aggregate demand increases to 83 and our equilibrium moves to this E3. Now again, notice that as we move from E1 to E3, the price levels in the economy, they will increase. But as long as we are in the short run, we are assuming the wages, they stay stuck and they don't increase in line with these price levels. But as the long run arrives, long run has been defined as that time period after which the wages become unstuck and they start increasing with or in line with the earlier increases in the price level. Now again, monetarists had some sort of a justification for this, because they said that, look, once you move beyond your potential, then you see you will be putting a lot of pressure on the country's resources. There would be hardly any person who is unemployed. There would hardly be any resource that is left unutilized, and therefore firms and businesses will gradually see that their cost of production is increasing, and things are becoming more expensive because the country is basically running out of resources. Now, a short word for all of this is that economists say that when the economy moves beyond its potential, then it will start running into bottlenecks. So eventually these bottlenecks and the fact that price levels had already increased would mean that wages would eventually get unstuck and they will start increasing to catch up with the increasing price levels, and as a reflection of these bottlenecks in the resource markets. And when wages increase, the cost of production will increase, and that we have already learned this increase in cost of production would mean that this aggregate supply will start shifting to the left, and monetarists believe that this supply curve will shift to the left until and unless you come to this point where in this new equilibrium the country will end up again producing its potential GDP. Now, based on this analysis, the overall conclusion of the monetarists is that in the short run, every economy will experience these fluctuations around its potential GDP. And these monetarists call these short-run fluctuations the short-run business cycles. And they say that these business cycles, and most of the economists agree that these business cycles, fluctuations of GDP around its potential in the short run, are inevitable. They are a natural part of every economy, so you can't avoid them. But the monetarists, they claim that you don't need to worry about them. You can ignore these short-run business cycles, because they are self-correcting as the economy, when it moves into the long run and as the wages finally adjust, the economy will automatically move back to its potential output. And since the economy, according to these monetarists, is always going to move back to its potential output in the long run, therefore these monetarists claim that you can think of the long run aggregate supply curve simply as a straight vertical line passing through that country's potential GDP. Now, the overall message out of all of this theoretical build-up of this theoretical world of sticky wages and potential GDPs and so on and so forth, the overall practical message of the monetarists is that, you see, you should ignore and you should not worry about these short-run fluctuations such as these deflationary gaps, which are going to be practically painful. Because when you go into a deflationary gap, when you go below your potential GDP, then there will be unemployment, there will be economic pain. But these monetarists are saying, ignore this short-run pain, ignore this short-run deflationary gap, because eventually you will be back at your potential output, and therefore your focus should be on trying to increase the country's potential output. Try to increase the country's productive capacity so that the country's long-run aggregate supply curve increases, shifts to the right, because if you achieve that, then your economy will still fluctuate, but it will fluctuate around this much larger, much higher amount of GDP, and therefore you are going to be better off. Now, let me give you an example. that would help you understand the message of these monetarists. Just think about two athletes and assume that one of these athletes has an average speed of 30 kilometers per hour and this other athlete has an average speed of, let's say, 60 kilometers per hour. Now, if they are asked to run a, let's say, 50-kilometer race, then obviously none of them will be able to maintain this average speed continuously throughout the entire race. Obviously, they will both fluctuate around their average speeds, around their potential speeds. But those fluctuations don't really matter, because without even knowing, okay, who fluctuates more around this average speed and who is able to maintain this average speed for longer, without knowing anything about those fluctuations, we should be able to clearly see that, look, this athlete is going to win because her potential average speed is much more. So she might fluctuate, but she will be fluctuating around 60 kilometers per hour. This girl here, she will be fluctuating around 30 kilometers per hour. So clearly she is going to lose. And the monetarist message for the economy is exactly the same. Forget about these short-run fluctuations. Yes, sometimes it can be painful. In fact, recession is basically when you stay in this deflationary gap for a consecutive period of 6 to 8 months. And these monitors are telling you, forget about those recessions, ignore them. Just focus on increasing the potential. They believe in the efficiency and self-correction of the economy, and they believe that eventually in the long run you will come to your potential output. Now I have explained that message through this example of these two athletes, but economists, they have a much more formal and you can say the typical boring graphical way of expressing the same message, that ignore the business cycles and the potential output is more important. They express this idea more formally through what is known as a business cycle graph. So let me explain to you what that business cycle graph is. Now it's a simple graph where on the x-axis you take time, and usually you take a longish view. So think in terms of 5 years and then 10 years and then 15 and 20 and 30 years. So we have a longish sort of a time period over here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the GDP. GDP meaning we can mark out potential as well as the real GDP over here. So let's first of all mark out the potential GDP in this graphical space, the business cycle graph, in red. Now the idea of monetarists is that, look, and let us assume that a certain country has, let's assume, a sort of a constant potential output throughout the years. So let's call that YP, or we can call it anything, but let's call this the YP curve. This is showing the amount or the size of country's potential GDP along these different years. Now the monetarist message is that, look, the economy, it will not always be on this potential. Sometimes it will be on potential, sometimes below potential, sometimes above potential. That is, the economy will fluctuate. It will experience these short-run business cycles. And what really matters, what the monetarists are saying is, don't try to sort of avoid these business cycles. Don't lose your attention or focus or energy trying to control these business cycles. They will always occur. So instead, what you should do, according to these monetarists, is to try that after every 5, 10, 15 years, your potential output, try to increase that. Because as you move along this x-axis from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years, and as a country, if you are able to increase your potential output, then you will still fluctuate, you will still have these short-run cycles around this potential. But since your potential gets much larger, then after 20 years, you will be much better off than this economy, regardless of whether you are in a down cycle and in a deflationary gap or recessionary gap, because your potential is so much more, and therefore you will be revolving around this much larger potential. So that concludes our analysis of the monetarist approach, the monetarist version of this model of ADAS. And with that, we can now move on to the second version, the Keynesian version of this model of ADAS.